I'm a lawyer with the law firm of Shoemaker, Lupe Kendrick, and I have the pleasure of serving as the 2015 chairman of the Greater Tampa Chamber of Commerce. I also had the pleasure of leading our delegation last week to our historic meetings in Havana and outside of Havana in Cuba. I'm joined here with me this morning by some of my colleagues who are on our trip. Joe Lopano, director of our airport, Tampa International Airport, Jose Valiente, CPA in town, and one of my predecessors as past chair of the board. You all know Betty Castor, our former USF president, our former Secretary of Education in the state of Florida, and a former state senator here. And the funnest guy in the room, we have Jim Dean, the head of Busch Gardens here. We're also joined by Jason Woody, who's the CEO of the Lions Eye Institute for Transplant Research on the trip, Alex Sink, and a number of other folks who are on the trip with us. We are very honored to be able to bring back our experience from Cuba to hear and share it with the Tampa Bay region. This trip was the third trip this Greater Tampa Chamber of Commerce took to Cuba in the past few years, but it was certainly the most productive and the most historic. During this trip, we learned of the enterprise zone that Cuba is building around their Fort Mariel. We met with the director of the enterprise zone. We met with the National Institute of Oncology and Radiology with representatives from the Moffitt Cancer Center and built some historic relationships around research and clinical care. We met with the Lions Eye Institute and their counterpart on the Eye and Tissue Bank in Cuba. Mr. Woody is going to speak a little bit to that later today. We saw we saw the Hemingway Marina and met with the Commodore there. And maybe most importantly, we met with Ambassador Desereau at the head of the U.S. intersection in Cuba, having discussions about what our government is doing with respect to relaxing the embargo and the trade restrictions on the path to normalizing trade relations. Make no mistake, this chamber's role is to position the Tampa Bay region to be ready to do business in Cuba, with Cuba, importing and exporting when the switch gets flipped. We're not here today to comment on what our government is doing. That's their business. Our business is commerce, first and foremost. And this Tampa Bay region has a long historic tradition of trade and commerce going back to the 16th century with Cuba. We found Cubans to be very welcoming and inviting across the board to our delegation. And we saw tremendous possibilities and potential in trade in Cuba, whether it's through information technology, construction, healthcare, all kinds of facilities and infrastructure improvements that might be necessary, and culture, most importantly, culture. I'm going to let each of our panelists here give their impressions, and then we'll go ahead and open up for questions here. And I want to give also a special thanks before we do that to Frank Reno. Frank and his travel agency did a fantastic job of getting this group of Cuban novices around the islands. Frank, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Joe, why don't we lead off with you?
Sure. Joe Lopano, CEO of Tampa International Airport. Good morning. Thank you for being here. This was my second time to Cuba, to Havana. And the reason for these trips is it's all about the business of our airport. In 2011, the president allowed new gateways to be designated to Cuba. That was not allowed prior. Since that time, we've made about $4 million at the airport because of the fact that we're allowed to have flights to Cuba. And now there's further loosening of restrictions that's taking place, and we're seeing growth in the market, which is very important for us. We don't get involved in the politics. We get involved in transporting people. That's our job. And since it's now a little bit easier to go to Cuba, we've seen just in 2014 versus the prior year, a 35% increase in passengers. And so from the airport standpoint, I think it's very important for us to be there creating the relationships. We'll let the politicians decide who can go, but we want to be ready to transport them through Tampa International Airport. Thank you, Ron.
I'm Jose Valiente. I went to Cuba once before, and that was in the year 2010. And of course, back then, we had to go through Miami to be able to go to Cuba. and the ability to go straight from Tampa is a remarkable convenience to all the Cuban Americans here. You don't have to go to Miami one extra night and get up at the wee hours of the morning to get on a plane. And it took an hour from here to Cuba. That was it. It was wonderful. JetBlue, leaving out of the best airport in the world.
Nothing against Miami Airport, but we like that. Just saying.
Anyway, I have a different take on everything that we're doing. Of course, I'm involved with the Chamber, and everything about the Chamber and what we do is about the business and bringing opportunities to our members. But I have an ulterior motive for all of this, which is the people living in Cuba today. The people living in Cuba today, those are the people that I care about, and all the stuff that we're doing, so it's going to help them eventually. It's going to better their lives eventually. And that's why I got involved in all of this, and why I so much favor what's going on right now. The best, by the way, as far as the tourist aspect of Cuba, between 2010 and now is like day and night. We went to probably 7 or 8 different restaurants in Cuba.
Yes.
Maybe 1 or 2 were government owned, but the rest were privately owned restaurants. The quality of the food was, and the service was fantastic. Much better than in 2010. In 2010, it was not there. And you see a lot of people employed in the industry area. A lot more taxis. Between 2010 and now, the vintage cars are 100 times more. I don't know where they came from. There's vintage cars everywhere. And that's because they make good money in renting and taking people around the city, or renting them to take you anywhere. So that's a good source of revenue for the locals there, the vintage cars, as well as transportation. Any car that they can fix and rent, that's good for them. The best description, I went to visit my hometown, and I had a driver that took me there, and the best description that I have ever heard about the Cuban people is that he told me this is a country of 11 million scientists. And that's because every morning we have to get up and invent a way to get through that day, or get through the things that we have to do. So I heard a lot of excitement about what's going on. For the first time, there's a little bit of optimism for the people there. The people of Cuba are wonderful people, fantastic people. I said this back in 2010, and I kept saying this time. Whenever you meet a Cuban for the first time, it never feels like it's the first time. You strike a conversation with them, and they're your friends when the conversation is over. It's amazing, just wonderful people. I was able to go into the inner part of the country. The roads are a challenge. Okay, so that's an area that there's a saying that says in order to eat an elephant, how do you eat it? What's the best way to eat an elephant? Is one bite at a time. Cuba's a big elephant, but one bite at a time we'll get there, and hopefully it's going to be good for business and good for the people there.
Thanks. So then, one of the things that we have been working very diligently for, and that we brought to Cuba, was the desire for the Tampa Bay region to be the situate for the Cuban consulate when relations are normalized. As many of you know, the Greater Tampa Chamber of Commerce passed a resolution about a month ago supporting the siting of a Cuban consulate here in Tampa. Tampa was the place where the Cuban consulate existed prior to 1959. We believe it should go back to its rightful location, not physically the exact same spot, but this region. And we also worked with City Council here in Tampa to have City Council pass a similar resolution. We took that message down to Cuba, and it was very well received. We heard folks talk about how their grandparents took the ferry back and forth to Tampa Bay, how they were aware that we had a whole park, some folks said a whole park dedicated to Jose Marti here in Tampa. There was just an excitement and enthusiasm for reconnecting with this area. I neglected to mention that Betty Castor is also the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board member, as well as her past roles today. I'm going to turn over to you.
Great. Well, this was my first trip to Cuba, so I'm the neophyte in the group, but I want to echo the compliments to Joe. The re-entry at Tampa International Airport was just the smoothest. I've done a lot of traveling. This was a walkthrough, so that was great. And to Jose, the people in Cuba could not have been friendlier or more welcoming to us. I was particularly interested in the potential for cultural and educational exchanges. While we were there, our group visited the artist Fuster, who is a world-class ceramics artist. We visited his galleries, his workshop. He sells his product. We all came home with a product from his workshop, but he puts the money back into his neighborhood, and you can see the self-help example in that incident. We also visited other galleries, and as I say, we have brought back some beautiful work. There is no reason why we shouldn't be having some exchange and taking art from this country to Cuba and bringing artists from Cuba here. And I think that's a way to build relationships. When we were at the U.S. interest section, we had a briefing from one of the members of the staff. But I was amazed to look around and see that there were over a dozen students from Washington State University who were studying, and they were on a study tour in Cuba. Interestingly, they were journalists and communications majors. Today, Florida students cannot travel to Cuba, Florida public university students. And I hope that that changes, and I hope that along with the Chamber, we can work to build the educational exchanges, because education and culture will be a key to establishing normalization.
Jim?
Thanks, Ron. First, I'm Jim Dean. I'm the president of Busch Gardens, and I was visiting Cuba and Havana for the first time, and I was awfully excited to get the opportunity. I want to thank Ron and Bob Rohrlach and the Chamber of Commerce and your staff, Bob. A great trip and a great opportunity for all of us to get a firsthand look at what's going on in Cuba. And from my perspective, it was about tourism and hospitality. And as I think the rest of the people we heard from this morning, the Cubans were very hospitable, very welcoming, and we couldn't have had a better experience in terms of the hospitality they exhibited to us. And there's just a beautiful island to be discovered there, and one that when and if the embargo is lifted, I think Americans will enjoy. And the tourism industry has tremendous potential there. And once the economy begins to grow, I think we'll find Cubans will enjoy not only Florida. We have a very robust, obvious tourist industry here, and in the Tampa Bay region. But I think we'll see a lot of tourism from the Cubans as well. So I was very encouraged by what I saw, and thought that it was a great trip for all of us. We learned a lot, and I echo what everyone else in the panel said this morning. It was a great learning experience, and I wish everyone could have gone with us, because it's real potential for us here in the Tampa Bay region, and there's a natural relationship between Tampa Bay and Cuba, and I think we are very well poised to take advantage of that. Thank you, Ron.
You know, sometimes you have to travel abroad to appreciate what you have at home, and our assets here, like our great colleges and universities, like Busch Gardens, like the greatest airport in the world, like Joe's Airport, is really phenomenal. I have a feeling Joe might have a consulting gig at other places, because everywhere I travel, it's just great here. Or whether it's companies like Emily Oil, who are very civically engaged and involved, and great economic engines in this region, or healthcare institutions like the Lions Eye Institute or the Moffitt Cancer Center. This great Tampa Chamber of Commerce is the voice for businesses in the Tampa Bay region. And a critical part of our trip was to carry that voice, carry that message, carry the moniker of businesses here down to Havana, Cuba. We see tremendous potential for all business in this region. We saw a government there that seems to be willing to loosen up and change some things. We saw a populace that was very receptive to American culture, American business, and we saw a lot of kinetic pent-up opportunity. And make no mistake, this great Tampa Chamber of Commerce will continue to be a leader in this region for making sure that when that switch gets flipped, when the government of the United States makes it permissible to do greater business deals and better import and export there, that this region will be ready. One of the other things I wanted to mention a little more acutely is we visited the what I loosely translate as the National Institute of Oncology and Radiology there. This was a very sophisticated cancer hospital in Havana. We had a strong delegation from the Moffitt Cancer Center, which is our jewel in the Tampa Bay, jewel in the Tampa Bay region, with respect to being a National Cancer Institute designated comprehensive cancer center. And the room really lit up when these folks from Havana, when these physicians and administrative leadership met and shook the hands of the delegation from the Moffitt Cancer Center and the rest of us from the Tampa Bay region were there. Their faces literally lit up. They have 39 or so active clinical trials going. They talk with us about training of residents and fellows. They talk with us about research. I know that Jason, and maybe Jason, you can come up for a minute before we take questions and talk a little bit about the connection that the Lions Eye Institute made with your iBank counterpart there. This is Mr. Jason Woody. He's the president and CEO of the Lions Eye Institute here in Tampa Bay. The Lions Eye Institute is the largest eye tissue bank in the United States, based here in Tampa, retrieving corneal tissue statewide and placing that corneal tissue for transplantation worldwide. Jason?
Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you everyone for the media for coming today. As you can see, we have a business component, but if you saw the shift, there was definitely a humanitarian component to going to Cuba. And I had the opportunity, I had visited Cuba first through organization in 2003 to sort of look at corneal transplantation as far as help people that are visually blind or visually impaired. Cuba has a population of about 12 million people. They have an older population, very similar to us in Florida. Matter of fact, if you look at the two, they're strikingly similar. So they're seeing the same thing as far as people that are blind or visually impaired. In 2003, they were doing roughly maybe about 100 corneal transplants per year. Last year, they did almost 900. So in a decade period, they've really expanded their services for helping people. And I was able to meet with our counterparts there having a program. And at the same time, we found that we've already identified 2 ophthalmologists that are planning to come to the States to train with us right here in Tampa to see the technologies. They want the education. They have one of the highest population of medical personnel to just non-medical personnel in the country. So they've done a phenomenal job there. It was a wonderful experience there. And I think that we can actually learn from each other as well as we try to help on a humanitarian side, but we both want to accomplish.
Before I take questions, I'll make one last comment. Make no mistake, other regions of this country are positioning themselves to take advantage of this opportunity. New York Mayor Cuomo took a delegation down there about a month or so before we got there. We have understanding that folks from New Orleans, from Charlotte, from really all over the country are making these connections. As we traveled around, we saw folks, we met other Americans from all other parts of the world. Florida and the Tampa Bay region cannot afford to stand flat-footed while the rest of the world positions itself to take advantage of this economic opportunity. This is about jobs. This is about economic growth. This is about positioning the Tampa Bay region to be a competitor in the world economy. And we cannot afford to stand flat-footed. We must move forward. So with that, we're going to go ahead and open the floor to questions.
What's next for this group? And did any of you all bring back photographs, video, mementos that we could shoot video out to share with our viewers?
Sure. I think we all took quite a bit of photos. I'm not sure of the quality of them. I think we'd be happy to share some photos and videos with you. And what's next for us is continuing to follow up, continuing to work with businesses in this region, our port, our airport, Busch Gardens, others, as well as our governmental delegation. Betty's daughter, Kathy Castor, has been very supportive and very, very good partner to us in this. We continue to have discussions with the Department of State, Department of Commerce, and the White House about the U.S. consulate issue, and we will continue to take the lessons we learned and the context that we made and build upon them.
Critics have said that the economy of Cuba is only really the size of Lakeland, for example. So I guess what they're saying is it's not worth the problems that it could create back home to go there to try to bring business to such a small economy. So what's the response to that?
Sure. As far as I understand it, I'm not an economist, but as far as I understand it, there's 12 million people in Cuba. And the economy today, because of the embargo, may be smaller, but we believe that the potential there is much bigger than the economy of Lakeland, which is also a wonderful place. I would also submit to you that the Tampa Bay region and many of our businesses would cherish the opportunity to court the business of the entire city of Lakeland. The Tampa Bay region is made up of regional, local, and statewide businesses. So while some other regions might feel that the opportunity is not big enough for them, not important enough for them, what we're hearing from our members are a 12 million person market is a market that we want to go into. I might ask Joe to just talk a little bit about the economic impact that flights to Cuba, which Joe and we worked back in 2011 to get, have made to this region, just as an example of how that, what some folks might call a small market, is having an impact directly on our economy. Joe, do you mind talking about how many flights we have and the economic impact?
Yeah, it's, back in 2011, when the government allowed us to be designated as a gateway, we started flying to Cuba, and our flights were full immediately. So although it might be a small economy, for us it's big business because we have such a strong relationship with Cuba. We have Cuban Americans here, like Jose, who want to go back, who are allowed to go back to see their relatives. They used to have to drive to Miami or some other gateway. Currently they fly out of Tampa, come back through our great customs facility, and it's very, very convenient. So for us, we generate about $1 million a year, just revenue to the airport, which wouldn't have been gotten had we not done this, right? So that $1 million flows right to the bottom line because the lights are on, the air conditioning's on, and all of a sudden we get, people going to Cuba. So from our standpoint, although the economists might say it's a small economy, it's real money for the airport, and it's important for us to continue to grow that business.
I might ask Jim Dean to talk about what kind of incremental impact that travelers from Cuba might have on a place like Busch Gardens.
Sure. Thanks, Ron. I think the opportunity is the future. Clearly, there's a lot of infrastructure that's needed in Cuba today, and I think their economy is poised to grow, and it will take some work, and it will take some time, but as all things do. But in time, I think there's, as we've said, 12 million tourists in that country that would be very excited to visit Tampa Bay and certainly Busch Gardens, as well as the other attractions in our region. And I think as their economy grows and their income levels grow, I think we'll see a lot of travelers arriving to Joe's Airport and to our hotels and our attractions. And I'm certain there'll be tourists from the Tampa Bay area, as well as Florida and the rest of our country, that'll be very interested in seeing Cuba the way we saw it. And certainly at some point in the future, there'll be great resorts and amenities and facilities there that they don't currently have, but will someday. And as Ron says, we want to be poised and ready to take advantage of those.
By way of exports, not to put him on the spot, but Mr. Barquette from Amalie Oil was on the trip. Would you mind coming up and just speaking to what you see the potential for a company like Amalie there?
Sure. To everyone's point on the panel, first of all, thank you, and the media. To your point, the original question, we export into around 100 countries, and then we import some products from those as well. We consider 12 million population country as a pretty big deal, because you can leverage that over time. And a lot of the people, maybe there's people that have left there over the last 15 or 20 years, but when you go there, the place is beautiful. All it needs is some changes with the government, and things will dramatically change there. Just to give you an idea of the port, we weren't allowed to go to the port, or they kept changing their mind, but we were able to do a presentation, or they did a presentation to us, PowerPoint, and they've spent money the same as Panama. So they'll be able to handle the post-Panamax cranes to unload these large containers. They're dredging to a depth of around 50 foot. And they're spending the money there to do all these things. They have transmogul from the port to a free trade zone. And they've got it all laid out, which maybe we'll share some of this with them on a PowerPoint, I believe, in the future, where there's different sectors like oil, pharmaceutical area, packaging area, and so on and so forth. So we consider that large for us. We're here, we have a domestic market, but we also export into 100 countries, and we're looking at this, and we're very interested in this thing opening up.
Thank you.
Ron, you said you met with the ambassador of the intersection. Any other government officials in Cuba?
We did. The only governmental officials we met with in the U.S. were all associated with the intersection, so we met with the ambassador and staff to the ambassador, essentially. And we had about an hour debriefing, and then we had a smaller meeting with the ambassador alone and about a half a dozen of us after the larger debriefing. And there was obviously I don't speak for the U.S. government, but what my perception was there was a great sense of optimism and forward momentum. They made some comments to us that they had the signage, figuratively, that they had the signage for the U.S. Embassy ready to be unveiled and put up once they got the word. The folks, the American representatives at the U.S. intersection there, clearly had a sense of progress and forward momentum in mind, and they were very solicitous of our opinions. As many of you might know, after one of our prior trips, a group of 6 of us here from the Greater Tampa Chamber of Commerce got an invitation to go to the White House and meet with the Vice President, and we spent about an hour one-on-one with Vice President Biden. This was prior to the December 17th announcements, and candidly, I naively thought that they wanted some reconnaissance on what was happening in Cuba, so we talked about what cab drivers were telling us and the old cars and things that we saw there. I think in hindsight, the White House was trying to gauge whether the business community in Tampa Bay was ready, whether we would be prepared to do business, and whether we were receptive to those ideas. And I believe that we did have an impact on those decisions, and we'll continue to do so.
When the switch gets flipped, in addition to what you want to see happen with the consulate, I'd imagine that you have a plan for a handful of things that ought to happen to position the Bay Area the way you'd like it to be positioned. Can you say what those things are?
Sure.
Yeah, what are the immediate first steps that need to be taken in the Tampa Bay area in the state of Florida?
It's a good question. And I will confess to you that the plan is a work in progress. Part of these trips is reconnaissance and information gathering. We think the first step is getting the consulate here and the normalization of relations. We as a chamber will not take any steps proactively to engage in business until it's appropriate with the U.S. government. Once that happens, and I think your question is once that happens, what are the next steps? I think forging a relationship between our airport and their airport to make sure that we've got easy travel between the two. Certainly we've got 10 plus flights a week right now, but we need a lot more than that, and I think this region is going to be known as the gateway between Cuba and the United States. That's a less than an hour flight. Our airport's wonderful. We can get folks there very quickly. We've got the largest deep water port, the closest deep water port to Port Havana. I think forging relationships between the Tampa Bay port and their port. And then I think building some fundamental business relationships like Amalie Oil, building some cultural relationships like Busch Gardens and our other arts and cultural organizations in the region, forging those healthcare relationships, which we started during this trip, between places like the Lions Eye Institute and the Moffitt Cancer Center and their counterparts in Cuba, having some technological exchanges, some brain power exchanges between the two. Those are along the critical path to having a full-blown trade relationship between the two. And if anyone else here on the panel wants to speak
I
to it
think
as well.
the cultural exchanges are important as well. The last evening that we were there, the Minnesota Orchestra played to a sellout audience. Now, granted, the tickets were 50 cents, but it generated a major article in the New York Times yesterday that some of you may have seen. But those kind of exchanges where people can play together, where artists can exchange ideas, musicians can exchange ideas, I think goes hand in hand with the kind of trade relationships that we want to build.
We also had a baseball exchange. Thanks to the Tampa Bay Rays. They gave us a box of brand new baseball, about 100 or 50 bunch of baseballs, and about 40 or 50 baseball caps. So right now in Havana, we have baseballs and caps everywhere from Tampa Bay Rays. We stopped at a ball field on the way back to Havana from a trip, and we got off and they were so elated. I don't think they haven't seen a new baseball in I don't know how long, because they had to tape up the balls and so forth. So they were elated to get
the sport of hockey to them as well, because the Lightning were playing when we were down there. We all were seeking the scores, so we were trying to find some satellite feed to do that and asking Cubans about if they knew what the Lightning score was. Some folks had looks, but some folks knew what it was. Joe?
One thing to your question about, once the switch is flipped, what's our plan? From the airport standpoint, we have served as many as 3 cities already in Cuba, Holguin, Santa Clara, and Havana. But we also were able to see another city, Veradero, which is a very interesting opportunity for the airport should the restrictions be lifted to allow people to go for tourist reasons. So we see the opportunity to expand into a couple of other Cuban cities should the restrictions be lifted.
What do you mean by the switch being flipped? What do you need to see happen before you're willing to start putting a plan together? Because there are trade opportunities right now, they were just expanded, so you can just explain that.
Sure. What I meant by the switch being flipped is the end of the trade embargo, the full end of the trade embargo, so that's going to open up things fully, and certainly the travel restriction. There are some limited exceptions, and certainly after December 17th, those exceptions widened a bit, but there's still banking challenges with doing business in Cuba, and a general reticence of business to engage in activity that might get them in trouble. We heard stories there about, for instance, from the cancer hospital in Cuba, about them trying to obtain medical equipment, but U.S. companies being reticent to sell them the equipment for fear of any kind of repercussion or fine from our government here. So that at some point, those restrictions will end totally, and when those restrictions end totally or get more materially reduced, then we think the floodgate is going to be open.
You talked a little bit about some of the opportunities, different interest rates, that sort of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you foresee for business, even after the switch is flipped? That's the terminology we're using. What are some of the challenges that you have identified that you would have to deal with?
Yes, it's an excellent question. But the first thing that comes to my mind is that we as a country are a little bit behind the game. The French president was there the day before we visited. There are European nationals, French, Spaniards, Italians. There are a lot of Canadian investment. You see Canadian flags over industrial buildings and things. Brazilians, Chinese. The United States is the only country in the world that has a trade embargo against Cuba, so the foreign investment has already begun. And so I see one challenge for us as being a little bit, getting out of the gate a little bit slowly. Clearly, Cuba has been under 50 plus years of communism, and their economic system is not one set up to facilitate commercialism. Although what I saw, for instance, by the head of the enterprise zone that we met with, they understand philosophically what direction they need to head, at least in pockets there. Challenge is taking that philosophical understanding and operationalizing it. They have tremendous infrastructure needs, so that the things that we do business with every day, the information technology, we go in to buy a soft drink and the person's got an iPad and we swipe our credit card and the transaction's taken care of. They don't have the IT infrastructure in place to support that. And so there's going to need to be a lot of investment in infrastructure in order to facilitate broad commerce there. They did talk with us about their updating of the railway system and some logistical type improvements, but those are some of the things I see, and I welcome the rest of the panel if anyone else has comments.
Financial and banking services. It's critical right now that the regulations be set up so that American financial institutions can operate, because companies like Amelie are not going to want to do business in Cuba unless they are assured that they're going to get a payment in the currency that they can trade in. So that's one of the things that they definitely brought up.
And just credit card transactions.
No one would know better.
Yeah, no credit cards. It's still a cash economy, and that's a problem for those of us who travel a lot and we don't like cash.
and no one would know better than our former chief financial officer, obviously, who was on the trip, and so she's here to answer questions as well.
I'll give you an example of a great, one positive opportunity. I was at the cashier, and I started a conversation with a gentleman who was using a credit card. I said, "Where is that credit card from?" So he said, "It's a bank from Mexico." So we started talking a little bit. He's a Mexican gentleman who was granted the first license to do business inside the Port Mariel free zone. And he started a manufacturing company, a food manufacturing company. And so that's a great way for in the future for American companies to go over there to start a manufacturing company or a call center or something and employ the local people. So that's another future benefit from all of this.
Ron, I could add something as well. You know, one of the things that we heard quite a bit was that things were under renovation, and we would see one building after another, a highway, railroads, and so forth, and everything was under renovation. And I think we've heard from a few people that have been on previous trips, and that things have progressed over the last 3 or 4 years. This was my first trip, so it was a little bit shocking. The infrastructure didn't look like it was there, and they have a long way to go. It's a marathon, not a sprint for them. But it's my understanding from our trip that things have progressed over the last few years and that they're making progress. So that is encouraging. And Ron, as you said, there are a lot of tourists there now. There are just very few Americans there. So I think the potential is really unlimited for the Cuban people.
Well, one of the things that's great about going on these trips is you get to understand exactly what the potential is. So, I mean, for anybody in this room that thinks all of a sudden, if we lift the restrictions, we're going to have a huge billion-dollar economy, we don't have Switzerland 90 miles away. It's Cuba. And when I go down there from an airport standpoint, I look at infrastructure like hotels, restaurants, and so on. So how many people can you bring there and put them in how many hotel rooms? And it's going to be a long time before you can see major growth. I mean, that's just the reality. But that's the beauty of going on these trips, is you get to understand what the potential really is.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Nick, I understand that this was your first trip to Cuba, no? So I would like to know if Busch Gardens has plans in Cuba. I mean, in the future. I was in Cuba 2 times, and they have big museums, schools, galleries, but what about parks? Have you?
Sure. You know, as I said earlier, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. It's as Joe said, it's probably gonna be a long time. They have a lot of things they need before they get into attractions like a Busch Gardens. And one of the things that occurs to me is if the embargo were lifted, we have an island of 12 million people, and how many people would be looking for employment? And you know, in our market, I employ close to 5,000 team members at Busch Gardens, and could I employ some Cubans for the summer? Students that want to come to Tampa and work in our park here in Tampa for the summer, and I absolutely could. I could employ thousands of Cubans if they were allowed to come work for a period of time in our market. So there's opportunities, going both ways. Building a Busch Gardens in Cuba probably isn't in our lifetime, but I think at some point there will be attractions there, and as Joe said, there'll be resorts and modern hotels, and I think that is to come.
If we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
You alluded to the state's ban on public university students going to Cuba. Please remind me, is this something that the Chamber has taken a position on?
Chamber hasn't taken a formal position on it that I'm aware of, but we generally support trade back and forth between the two, and certainly we would support education, and we believe that, I don't want to speak for any university in the region here, but we believe that on one of our prior trips, President Genchak was on the trip as well, and I believe she saw the potential for educational exchange, and we certainly would support that as something that drives commerce.
I do wonder, it would take an act of the legislature to
Well, the current statutory ban is related to Cuba being on the terrorist list. So when that is lifted, that statutory ban, as I understand it, will not be active. However, the Board of Governors recently passed a policy for the state universities that would still prohibit Florida students and faculty from going to the island at state expense. Now, I think we are unique in the country in that regard. I don't know of any other state university system that has that prohibition.
And I just wonder, given the political climate in Tallahassee, where there's not a lot of ardor to embrace things that the Obama administration has initiated, whether you might see some resistance to, even if the country comes off the terrorist list and the embargo is lifted, there's still being some resistance to addressing the policy that the Board of Governors.
Private institutions in Florida can travel.
Sure. Yeah.
And they travel now, and a lot of our faculty can go through those private institutions. And I think eventually the Board of Governors will see the wisdom, because there will be a lot of academic exchanges. So it's really unfortunate in a way. It hurts our faculty, because students can generally do a study abroad or visit through some other institution.
Our legislature did pass a resolution suggesting that the state of Florida did not want a consulate in the state of Florida. We here at the Chamber respectfully disagree with our colleagues in Tallahassee on that, and like they have a constituency, we have a constituency, and our constituency here in the Bay region is supportive of locating a consulate here in Tampa Bay. We want to make sure that there's not any confusion by them having passed that resolution as to what our position is and what the position of businesses in Tampa Bay are. We support having a consulate here. Any other questions? We thank you very much for being here today.